I'm Grace. Welcome back to Stitch Stream, a podcast where we chat about all things sewing, give some sewing inspiration, and keep each other accountable with our sewing projects. I need that, and maybe you do too. Go ahead and get out your current work in progress and follow along as we talk through all things sewing. On today's episode, just for fun, we're going to talk through 3 of the top trending sewing related terms on Google from this past week. And then we're going to get into 5 sewing terms that every absolute beginner sewer should be familiar with to get your projects to the next level. This past week, the number 1 sewing related search trend on Google was Belk and Sewing Down South collab. Now, after looking into this, it has nothing to do with sewing, so everyone be warned, if you go down to the South and you see a store called Sewing Down South, you're not going to walk in there and find fabric or needles or anything for your sewing projects. In fact, they sell $90 throw pillows, and it looks like they're doing a collab with the store Belk, which is a department store in the South. So please don't get fooled. When I saw this, I was like, ooh, I went on their website and I thought maybe I would find some cool notions or fabrics, and that is not the case. So I'm warning you now, don't get too excited if you come across that street sign. Now, what I did find out is that the creator of Sewing Down South is named Craig Conover. Apparently, he is the voice behind that TikTok trend that says, all you do is sit at home and work on sewing things. And then the voice comes back and says, what's wrong with my sewing? Apparently, that's him. So that was news to me, but mystery solved. Number 2 sewing related term that was trending on Google from this past week was noodles. Nuddles? Am I saying that right? This is a Utah sewing store chain. They have 4 locations. So it's good to know for any Utah people, Utahns. I'm not sure what you all call yourselves, but anyone in Utah who's looking for an alternative to Joann's, that's probably why it was trending. That's going to be my guess. The number 3 related search term was Lego sewing machine, and it looks like that can be found on the website Sewtopia. Let's get into talking about 5 sewing terms that every absolute beginner should know to avoid crash out. Number 1 is seam allowance. You will see this on every single pattern that you ever use. Every time you do a sewing project, you will need to be familiar with what seam allowance is, because this is the area that will allow your project to not tear apart. This is very important. To put it simply, seam allowance is the space between the edge of your fabric and the line where you stitch. When you cut out your pattern pieces, the extra bit of fabric around the edge is your seam allowance. So let's talk about why this is so important. On every sewing pattern that you try to follow along, there is going to be a seam allowance included in the pattern. Oftentimes it's 5/8, but not always. Always check your sewing pattern. When I first started sewing, I thought that I could ignore seam allowance, and this ruined a lot of my projects that I had spent hours working on. If your pattern calls for a 5/8 inch seam allowance and you sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, your final project is going to be much bigger than intended. If you sew with a wider seam allowance, it will be too small. That is the number 1 reason why a garment might not fit or why pieces on a project don't line up correctly. A lot of times, sewing machines even have markings on the needle plate to help you keep the seam allowance consistent. The number 2 term I would want every new beginner to be familiar with is backstitching. A backstitch is exactly what it sounds like. At the beginning and the end of every single stitch that you do on your machine, you will do a few stitches backwards and forwards to lock in that thread so that it doesn't come out when your garment pulls a little bit or when you put it through the washing machine. If you forget to backstitch your projects, your thread will unravel, and the things that you have sewed together, the pieces of fabric that you have put together, will come apart. Number 3, this one might sound quite technical, but it is very important to know, and that is called grain line. This matters because fabric has different amounts of stretch and drape depending on the direction that it's cut. If you cut pieces out that are off grain, your final project can twist and warp and hang in some very strange ways. Term number 4 is right sides together. You might see this abbreviated sometimes as RST. RST means right sides together, and that is when you go to sew your projects together, you want the right sides of your garment fabric. That way when you open it up, the seam that is on the inside will be hidden. Most fabrics have a right side and a wrong side. Honestly, right sides together is pretty straightforward. And if you are sewing on a fabric where you're not sure if there's a right side and a wrong side, it might matter a little bit less because both sides might look fine. But the abbreviation is really good to know, RST, right sides together. When I first started sewing, I actually sewed some things wrong sides together, thinking that that would make the most sense. And obviously, I wasn't able to use those projects. And finally, and everyone says this, and to be honest, in my projects, I've only started doing this more recently, and it has actually made my projects look so much better, and that is pressing your fabric. Pressing is different than a traditional iron. When you go to iron a piece of clothing because you want to wear it later that day, you're often running and steaming your iron over, stretching out the fabric. Pressing is different. It is done with your iron, but what you're actually often doing is setting in your stitches, making them stronger. It also helps to make your seams lie flat, which can add to a much crisper, more professional looking project. For a quick review, we have seam allowance, backstitching, right sides together, grain line, and pressing. When I first started sewing, all of these things gave me a lot of confusion, but they all do get easier, I promise. And these are the foundation of taking your projects from very ill-fitting, wonky, misshapen to just a little bit more elevated. I truly hope this was helpful for someone. If there are any other ideas that someone is struggling with in terms of sewing, please comment below. I would love to explore that together, and I hope to see you next time.